everybody, and welcome back to Lisa at the Edge. It has been a while. Thank you for taking the time to tune in. We are going to talk about the evolution of Azure Local today. So if you live under a rock and you missed the announcements at Ignite in November last year, so November 2024, announcing Azure Local, then go and check it out and read the blogs and watch the sessions. But what we're going to do today is we are going to take a look back at the evolution of Azure Local, because actually this has been in development for a decade, over a decade actually. So that's what we're going to do today. And to help me with that, I have got my good friend and colleague, Kenny Lowe. So let's bring him in. Hi, Kenny.
Lisa, hello. Good to be here.
I know it's been a while, right?
Mhm.
And with that in mind, it's been a while. So actually, I should probably give an update on what I'm doing now, and then we'll get you to give an update on what you're doing now as well. So I work now within the specialty pre-sales team at Dell Technologies. So I am a specialty pre-sales architect focused on all things Microsoft Hybrid. So Azure Local, formerly Azure Stack HCI, Azure Arc, anything that we are doing in the hybrid space with Azure. And it's great fun. I get to speak to customers and partners, covering all of EMEA as well. And so, yeah, really enjoying it. Kenny, do you want to give us an update on what you are doing now?
Sure. Well, I work as a member of technical staff in the Cloud Platforms Product Management Organization here at Dell, covering a broad swathe of different products, but a lot of that does fall in the Microsoft Adaptive Cloud portfolio there as well. In that vein there, I'm also a Microsoft Regional Director, Azure MVP like yourself, and an NVIDIA Enterprise Advisor now, which is a new one. All of which is a long way of saying that I don't hide away in a cupboard. I learn by speaking, sharing, and doing. So any opportunity to talk about and then get feedback about things that we're doing is super appreciated.
Amazing. And thank you for reminding me. Yes, I am also an Azure Hybrid MVP. Yeah, definitely a little bit rusty, but so today I've got you on to help me take a look at how we got to where we are, right, with the announcements of Azure Local in November, just a couple of months ago, right? So if you don't know, both myself and Kenny are based in Scotland. It's a little bit cold right now. That's why we're both wrapped up. But yeah, so Ignite happened a couple of months ago. There were some big announcements around Azure Stack HCI and the introduction of Azure Local. Microsoft went really heavy on their adaptive cloud strategy, right? That's been around for a little while now. And then we had a chat about what might be a useful kind of video to record. And we thought, let's take a look at how we got here. And when we started to look at where we have been and where we've come from, we realized that actually this has been over a decade in the making, and we have been involved in this space for that time as well, which was interesting.
Oh yeah.
So we're just going to kind of work through a high level timeline of that time and discuss the various evolutions in this space when it comes to Microsoft and Azure and their kind of hybrid approach, right? So it's funny because both you and me always say, that Azure has always been hybrid by design, right? A lot of people think, yep, Microsoft have only just realized that not all workloads are suitable to live in the native cloud, right, in a Microsoft data center. And so they have come out with solutions to serve those workloads and those needs, right? But we know that Microsoft have been working on this hybrid offering for quite some time. So if we look at some key dates, right, Azure launched in 2010, right? And we actually started to see the kind of first iterations and thinking around this hybrid offering in kind of 2014, 2015, right? So like 4 to 5 years after Azure launched, we started to see the first inklings of a hybrid offering. So that was Windows Azure Pack, right? Do you want to like talk a little bit about Windows Azure Pack and kind of what the thinking was around that time?
One of my first loves. Yeah. Windows
Yeah.
Azure Pack was a really interesting proposition at the time, because it was basically an on-premises portal made to look like Azure at the time, the Azure Service Manager portal at the time. And it ran on top of, Virtual Machine Manager with Service Provider Foundation, with Hyper-V 2012, and whatever storage you wanted really under the hood there at the time.
Yep.
And it was designed to look like Azure, and that was the point. So it wasn't the same code, it wasn't the same features, functionality. It was, here's a portal, it looks the same. It was
Yep.
provided for free, so you could download the Windows Azure Pack experience and install that. And as long as you had System Center and Hyper-V there, you could make use of that. And there were some really interesting things done at the time there as well. Like, there was a project called Project Phoenix, which was a plugin for Windows Azure Pack to allow you to manage Azure from on-premises. So you could log into your local portal and then deploy and manage virtual machines in Azure from there. So right back then, there was a push-pull as to where is the management portal? Is it on-premises? Is it in the cloud? Where is going to win out here? And I think we know where that's landed now. But the need for consistency across those has never gone away. And that was the first foray into that. And that was probably about 2013, 2014 at the time there as well.
And I think as well, on you go.
Yeah, I was going to say that was very much a DIY thing that you could do. So anyone could just download that and install it and do it there. The first product we saw making use of that in this space was the Cloud Platform System Premium from Dell and Microsoft. So that was a co-engineered solution, rack scale solution, which used Storage Spaces 2012 R2, Hyper-V 2012 R2, Virtual Machine Manager there, SPF, and then Azure Pack on top. And it was delivered as a rack scale thing. I think it was an entry point of about $1 million there. But that was the first foray into, let's call it hybrid cloud and consistency on-prem and in the cloud from from Microsoft, and it was with Dell at the time. So that was Azure Pack there in 2014, 15.
Amazing. So a decade ago. And you mentioned the word consistency there, right? And when I first entered this space around 2016, I remember that word has been around since then. When Microsoft attempted to define what they meant by hybrid cloud, it wasn't just, hey, you have some workloads in Azure and you have some workloads outside of Azure, and you might have a network connectivity between them, for example. They very much, from the get-go, set out their kind of vision for hybrid cloud, and it was about consistency. It was about consistency of experience, like user experience. So, you mentioned there about the Azure portal. It wasn't Azure, but it looked and felt like Azure. And that's definitely, I would say that's, whilst there have been a lot of changes, right, we're going to cover them, that, wait for it, has been extremely consistent, right, throughout this last 10 years, is that drive to have, they've definitely stayed on course with that vision of consistency.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And let's reclaim some terminology here as well, because hybrid and multi-cloud are things which have lost all meaning, I think, in many places now. And when you talk about having different cloud environments, let's call that public or private cloud or multiple of each. If you have multiple cloud environments with connectivity between them, that is by definition multi-cloud. That is when you have different ways of managing and supporting and licensing and everything between those, but you have some connectivity, maybe that's multi-cloud there. You're using multiple clouds. And the idea of hybrid is that you have consistency in what you run in the public cloud and what you run in your private cloud. And they are maybe you license them the same, support them the same, have some consistent features and hopefully consistent management and services experience there, but it's driving towards consistency in what you do with it and how you operate and what you run on it, not just there's a network between them there as well.
Yeah, agreed. And even multi-cloud, that can get a little bit confusing as well, because I totally agree. Are you using multiple cloud platforms? Is it a mixture of SaaS, different platforms, etc.? Okay, you're in a multi-cloud environment, but there is then, I think, a spectrum on if you are purposely using a multi-cloud strategy for your services and products, etc. And I think there's a spectrum there, and customers kind of fall at various levels on that spectrum. So they might purposely be choosing different platforms for different services and tools, and they're doing that very intentionally, and they have the skills, etc., around each of these. But actually, naturally, customers tend to back a horse, right? They tend to pick their kind of main technology partner that they want to invest in. And in the public cloud world, that might be like Azure or AWS, etc. And it can get you're right, it can get a little bit messy.
I would say though that those two terms, hybrid cloud and multi-cloud, are still, I think, reclaimable. We can still define those and use those, and they make complete sense. The one that doesn't anymore is cloud. That's just a lost cause. There's no point in trying to define what is a cloud, because it's just literally anything someone runs on-prem or a public cloud. That's terminology that's got away from the industry. It is meaningless now, so hey ho.
Yeah. Let's not let that happen to hybrid and multi-cloud. Okay, and there are some other terms that will come up through this chat as well that we can delve into. Okay, so that was like 2015 era, and then 2017 was an interesting year. That was the year that we actually we started to work together before that, 2016, 2015, but 2017 was the year that Azure Stack Hub, formerly Azure Stack, launched. And an interesting thing that you said at the beginning there was with Windows Azure Pack, we started to see the push and pull of where would the control plane live, right? Azure Stack Hub, originally announced as Azure Stack, and this is important, saw a pool, right, where actually the control plane came on premises. So do you want to talk a little bit about 2017 and the launch of Azure Stack Hub?
Yeah, it was a really interesting time, actually, because Azure Stack, as it was announced at the time, was really envisaged as a really big, broad play there to apply to an awful lot of different scenarios. So it was originally positioned for service providers. So the first airlift in Redmond was the Azure Certified for Hybrid Airlift for service providers. And lots of service providers went out there to learn about Azure Stack and how they could deploy a mini Azure region in their data centers to serve their customers. Turns out that running a mini Azure region is not as simple as it sounds, and that there's a tremendous amount of effort that needs to go into that, tremendous amount of engineering that goes into that. That does translate into cost, actually, if you boil it down to the nitty-gritty there. There's a minimum entry point of, 4 fairly beefy servers there. But on top of that, and probably more importantly, is the sheer amount of services that need to run on top. So to run the Azure portal and everything that went into that, there were about 30 different virtual machines running inside that to make it an Azure system. So not just 4 servers, but a mini Azure region there, completely locked down as a black box. And then Microsoft put a lot of engineering effort into making sure that that would just work for you. So you couldn't tweak it, you couldn't tinker with it, you couldn't make internal changes to it. The phrase internals are internal became something that you would get every time you spoke to Microsoft about Azure Stack there. How does this work? Internals are internal. Can we change this? Nope, internals are internal. And it was really there to deliver an outcome. And that outcome was, you want a mini Azure region in your data center, this is that. And this will deliver you that. There was if CPS Premium had a minimum entry point of $1 million or so, this was about $250,000 or so. So reducing the entry point there, but still a bit rich for a lot of people's blood. But it found a very strong niche and a very strong use case in tightly regulated industries, in military, in dark sites, in government around the world, and it remains to this day very strong use case in those scenarios there as well. And interestingly, there was some code, some deployment code from CPS that made it into Azure Stack Hub as well. So some of that initial launch of the Azure Pack system there went into Azure Stack as well and brought us forward there. So we don't abandon the past, we bring it forward and build on it. And I think that's why it's important for us to go through this timeline and heritage here to see actually where everything's come from. And I like it.
Yeah. So Azure Stack Hub, I remember we went to the airlift in Seattle. I was just amazed. I was thinking, if Azure, so at the time, and I think it's probably still similar, but Azure, stamp out their data centers and they increase storage by like 8,000 servers at a time, right? And basically what Microsoft had managed to do is bring Azure into this, 4-node minimum configuration. And it was at the time so impressive, right? It was really, really impressive. But like you say, it kind of got brought out, I think, to address the disconnected or the has to remain on premises type use cases, of which there are many, right? Other terms that we might want to define: disconnected, air gapped, right? Because as we'll see with the discussion of where the portal, the management plane should live, the push and pull, that's also changed. So I kind of see disconnected as, disconnected, air gapped as, you're not connecting to Azure, let alone the internet, right? So yeah, it came out. I think it came out, and the problem was the people who kind of took interest in it, so service providers, etc. It just wasn't the natural place for it. I think it was maybe ahead of its time. I think people seen it as a competitor to Azure, and it tried to get shoehorned into some of these places, which it didn't quite work, right? But as you said, over time, it found its niche. And that's kind of, I think, where it was aiming to go all along, but it found that niche in those like air gaps, like you say, military, government, etc. Use cases. So it found its way, right? It found its way. So that was 2017.
But also on that, I think that a service provider's value is defined by their uniqueness and what they can bring to their customers that no one else does. And Azure Stack allowed for no uniqueness there as a product. It was always the same regardless of who you were. So it was kind of antithetical to what a service provider does in a lot of ways, I think. But yeah, Azure Stack Hub found its niche. It is a product designed for disconnected operations. And so we had a product management, engineering, support, procurement, OEM lifecycle built around that path there. Disconnected operations, you have Azure Stack Hub. Wonderful.
Yes, awesome. Okay, that was 2017. Then we had a fun few years, right, with Azure Stack Hub. And then it was in actually 2019 that Microsoft introduced or announced for the first time Azure Stack HCI and Azure Arc.
Yes.
And these would become, these would kind of go on to become big focus points over the last couple of years, right? So yeah.
Let's take a roll back from that first, because before we got to Azure Stack HCI, there was also Windows Server HCI, as we now call it. So Microsoft first launched their first hyperconverged infrastructure capability with Windows Server 2016, when they launched Storage Spaces Direct with that. That was Microsoft's first foray into the hyperconverged infrastructure market. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the value in the Microsoft HCI space came from storage performance over and above anything else. I mean, you could compare Microsoft's HCI offerings to others in the market there. And if you were to create a table and compare features, it might not come off the best in that time. But from a storage performance perspective, it was always a leap above everything else. And that's where Microsoft focused a lot of their messaging on their Windows Server HCI offering. So if Microsoft came and spoke to you about running a hyperconverged infrastructure on Hyper-V, then storage performance would be a primary way to talk about that there as well. So you would buy your hardware from your OEM of choice, you would deploy that, install Windows Server, enable the Hyper-V role, enable the Storage Spaces Direct role, have an HCI system, and wonderful. The way that Dell ran through that was we initially launched some reference architectures in 2017. So a way to, let's call it a best recipe or a reference architecture, or a way to buy this and say, this will probably work well. We've done some testing. We then launched Storage Spaces Direct Ready Nodes. And I think that terminology is important as well, because it wasn't Windows Server HCI Ready Nodes. It was specifically Storage Spaces Direct Ready Nodes, because the focus was on the storage and on the storage performance there, because that was a primary selling point of that there as well. So Storage Spaces Direct Ready Nodes, which also integrated a joint support motion between Dell and Microsoft as well. So the first in the market to provide joint support offerings there for that, so that if something was going wrong, you wouldn't just be told to go talk to Microsoft. We'd work together to resolve that. So Storage Spaces Direct Ready Nodes enhanced that. We added Windows Admin Center integrations to make the management of that better and easier. And that was all great. But Windows Server itself had some challenges, which Microsoft were just fundamentally unable to address. Number one, Windows Server is a general purpose operating system that has to do a huge number of different workloads. It's not just there to do Hyper-V and storage spaces. So if you want to bring in new features, you have to not break Windows Server, and that's a high barrier of entry. So difficult to bring new features into it there. Also, the Windows Server lifecycle is every 3 years. So you want to bring new major features, you have to wait 3 years to bring those in. And that was just tied to that life cycle. So the announcement of Azure Stack HCI, as it was at the time, was really, I think of it as a fork of Windows Server, which really strips it down to its bare bones to just be an operating system for delivering an HCI system. So without all that other stuff in there, which makes it easier to bring new features, but also reduces the life cycle from 3 year to 1 year. So triple the pace of innovation, you could say. So being able to bring new features, functionality every year instead of every 3 years. So we went from, going from Windows Server 2016, 2019, 2022, to starting to talk about Azure Stack HCI 20H2, 21H2, 22H2, 23H2. And that was the yearly release of that OS there. But Azure Stack HCI, as announced and as released at that time, was an operating system. And I think that's an important point. It was there it was delivered to address shortcomings in Windows Server as the operating system to run an HCI system. That's what Azure Stack HCI was there to do. We've evolved from there again. But I think it's always important to understand why it was launched in the first place and how we evolved from that.
Yep. So the Azure Stack HCI operating system, this kind of fork in the road from the Windows Server operating system, went GA in December 2020. And I think we brought out our integrated system for Azure Stack HCI in February of 2021. And that is when Azure Stack HCI started its journey. And it's been a fast-paced last couple of years. And again, back to that point of, that was kind of the point, right? Is how can we bring new features and innovate faster on a hyper-converged infrastructure, but also how do we start to tie in Azure? So when it was released at GA, it was an operating system that you would consume from Azure. Yeah. And you could also view your infrastructure in the Azure portal. And here comes our kind of next pull and push between, hey, where is the control plane sitting? And so there was a change here, right? Instead of bringing that Azure control plane down to run on premises, like with Azure Stack Hub, there was almost, okay, the control plane can live in Azure. Lots of customers have workloads in Azure and they have workloads outside of Azure that they cannot bring in for various reasons. Those reasons can be met, or those kind of requirements can be met by allowing the workloads and the data to remain where they need to remain, whether that's at the edge or wherever in a data center. But the control plane, that can maybe live in Azure. And that's kind of, that was kind of the start of Azure Stack HCI, right?
Yeah, trying to bring Azure as the control plane for Azure Stack HCI was absolutely the goal. It was difficult as it was, though, because you can't just have the host operating systems talking direct to Azure. It's not really how it was designed. So what we had back then was really you could register your Azure Stack HCI to Azure, you could bill it through that, but management, that was more of a challenge there. To address that, Microsoft had to put in some form of intermediary in there, something that Azure could talk to and that would understand and manage everything under the covers there. So that's where the Arc Resource Bridge started to come in, and that started to come into preview early 22H2 there. So the Arc Resource Bridge is just a virtual machine that runs inside your Azure Stack HCI environment, which acts as an intermediary between your infrastructure and workloads and Azure itself. So Azure talks to the Resource Bridge orchestrates everything locally there. That kind of was the path to solve that problem. But it also, and we're probably going far too fast now, but the Arc Resource Bridge really evolved Azure Stack HCI as well, from being just an operating system to being a hybrid cloud solution, because it's that Arc Resource Bridge that allows you to, actually use Azure as the control plane for the infrastructure, for the workloads, for other Azure services on there. It is that Arc integrated service which elevates Azure Stack HCI from being an OS to being a full solution, which happens to have an operating system in there.
Yeah, so December 2020, the Azure Stack HCI OS went GA. February of 2021, we brought out our Dell integrated system for Azure Stack HCI. Actually, also in February 2021, Microsoft continued to evolve the Azure Stack portfolio, right? And they actually announced Azure Stack Edge. So that kind of happened. Then, as you said, we had this yearly cadence update. So we had, 22H2 in November 2022. And then it was really with, like you say, the introduction of the Azure Arc Resource Bridge and 23H2, where Azure Stack HCI really evolved and changed. And let's not, beat around the bush. It's been a little bit messy because of that.
Yeah, there's what I would, I don't like to use the word mistake, but there was a terrible mistake in my opinion, which was launching Azure Stack HCI 23H2 with that name. Because the implication is that Azure Stack HCI 23H2 is an incremental change from 22H2, evolving on the same path there. It was fundamentally a complete change as a product. So it went from, like I say, just being an operating system to being a hybrid cloud solution with a whole bunch more built in there. You get AKS out of the box. You can have AVD within there as well. It is a true hybrid cloud integrated solution there now. That is fixed now with the Azure Local rename. In my opinion, that should have happened right back at the start there, rather than going 22H2 to 23H2 to Azure Local. It should have just been Azure Local. Make it clear this is a new product delivering new functionality right from the off in there, rather than just an iterative step.
Yeah. With 23H2, we've seen, like we say, the introduction of the Azure Arc Resource Bridge, which enabled all of this extra functionality like AKS out of the box, Azure Virtual Desktop, the ability to deploy virtual machines from the portal, etc.
But you know what it also introduced?
Yeah.
It also introduced a new lifecycle management engine.
Yes.
So a whole new lifecycle management engine for automating the deployment and then the ongoing lifecycle management of that system. And I smile when I say new, because that lifecycle management engine comes from Azure Stack Hub. So that EC engine, the Enterprise Cloud Engine, which had years of effort put into it in Azure Stack Hub to make it robust and reliable there, has been ported into Azure Local now to do the same job there as well. And when I said that some of the code from Cloud Platform System made it into Azure Stack Hub, that moves into Azure Local as well now. So that 10 years of innovation there, there are lessons and some functionality that have come all the way there through end to end as well. So we're not reinventing the wheel every time.
No, 100%. Right. So other things that kind of happened in these happened 2023 and 2024, things kind of happened out of lockstep, right? They've all been brought together with the announcement of Azure Local, but at Dell, we released our premier solution for Azure Stack. Well, we call it our Apex Cloud Platform for Microsoft Azure, but it was our premier solution for Azure Stack HCI. And we released that in September 2023 in anticipation of 23H2 launching in February 2024. But again, because, maybe that, like you say, the continuation of the Azure Stack HCI name with 23H2, it didn't really hit home just how much that solution or offering had changed and evolved so significantly that, it was a bit painful. But so let's talk about that for just a few minutes. When Azure Stack HCI was first announced, there was a catalog, right, that you could go and view vendors' hardware offerings for that. And at the time, there were two categories. There was an integrated system and a validated node. There is now three categories, right? Premier, integrated, and still validated. Let's talk a little bit about why, and we've kind of hit on it already, right? The fact that Azure 23H2, Azure Stack HCI, Azure Local, big shift there. There was a higher requirement for co-engineered solutions from Microsoft partners like Dell to really deliver on kind of the promise of this solution. So can we talk a little bit about integrated, premier, validated?
And I'm going to pretend that in my world, Azure Stack HCI 23H2 never existed, and it was just called Azure Local. So I'm just going to pretend that it was always called Azure Local, so that we can have a neater cut over there, rather than the messy one that we had. But yeah, when Azure Stack HCI as an operating system launched, there were basically two ways provided to OEMs to deliver that as a solution: the validated nodes and the integrated systems. The validated node requirements are basically that you run a suite of tests on Microsoft Private Cloud Simulator to test, to do load balancing tests and failure tests and a few other tests there to make sure that, yes, this will work. You run that, you give the thumbs up, you go into the catalog, and then you never have to test again. So it's a one-time requirement for the validated nodes, and then you provide 5 years of hardware support. For Azure Stack HCI as an operating system there, that was the easy way for OEMs to get in. So if you look at the catalog, you'll see that the vast majority of people selling Azure local solutions, Azure Stack HCI as was, are doing validated nodes because minimal effort getting the catalog. The integrated systems had a higher barrier of entry, so you needed to install the operating, so not just a bunch of disparate boxes that arrive, but here is a solution that you can deploy as a holistic whole. You had to commit to doing ongoing solution validation as Microsoft released new updates up to 4 times a year for that operating system validation there. You had to do lifecycle management integration with Windows Admin Center, whole bunch of different things, plus joint support as well, which Dell pioneered with storage spaces direct ready nodes. That became a requirement for integrated nodes. So a whole bunch more that you had to do to deliver an integrated system versus validated there. And only a handful of OEMs actually did that. So Dell, Dataon, Lenovo, HP, I think, are the 4 there delivering integrated systems there, because it takes a lot more effort. But that was an operating system level validation there. Like you said, Azure Local is a lot more than that. So as we're coming up to the launch of Azure Local, which is, yes, the OS is still there, but you also have the Arc Resource Bridge now, which includes all the AKS components, and there are Arc extensions like the Lifecycle Management extension, monitoring extensions. There are a whole bunch more that go into that, which run on top of the system there, which aren't and can't be tested by the existing tools. So the Private Cloud Simulator doesn't test any of that stuff. So we wanted, and when I say we, I think that's okay to say we and Microsoft wanted to create a way where those new features, functionality could be tested as part of the solution. So we created a new category. We designed and developed a new category called the Premier Solution category. And yes, there are a whole bunch of requirements within that which go above and beyond the integrated system category. But the most important one for my money is that you have to put a bunch of hardware into Microsoft engineering, build out a CI/CD pipeline for testing that, which tests, yes, the OS features and functionality, but also the Arc functionality, the Azure Stack HCI functionality that runs on top as well. So that as new features and functionality are coming out at that level, not the OS level, that is tested before release there as well. Because operating system features come out, 1 to 4 times a year, depending on the year. And so it's relatively easy to stay on top of. But Azure Stack HCI features on top are coming out every month. You have new features and functionality and updates that come every month. So having a way to validate that became super important. So that's why the Premier Solution category came into being, and that is why we launched that in the first instance.
So just to sum that up, OS updates were for Azure Stack HCI once every quarter.
At the most.
With a major update each year, right? Azure Local OS updates at, again, once a quarter.
About the same, exactly the same.
But feature updates, which now happen at that solution level, that Azure Arc Resource Bridge level, the extension level, those can now come monthly, right?
Yes.
So we're really stepping up the pace, again, kind of like getting closer to what you would, it's not going to ever be the same, right? But closer to what you'd expect from like a cloud service, right?
But if we think back to that Windows Server to Azure Stack HCI OS to Azure Local now, originally moving from Windows Server to Azure Stack HCI OS was to move from 3-year lifecycle to 1-year lifecycle for the OS. The move to Azure Local is to be able to bring new features at that higher level on a monthly basis now. So yes, OS features still come, major ones still annually there, but now Azure Stack HCI features, Azure Local features, rather, come every month. And that has, so we've gone from updates every 3 years to every 1 year to every month now there. And that's fundamentally what it's designed to do.
And then the difference between integrated and Premier, just to make it really clear, the integrated solution tests the OS and it never tests the solution right the way up the stack, right? Extensions, lifecycle management engine, Azure Arc Resource Bridge, etc. Premier solution tests the whole thing. And that is I agree, the main point here.
Yes.
in terms of testing and validation. Okay,
But
so
I can be cheeky here as well and say that that is true. There is a distinct difference between the testing that goes into an integrated system and into a Premier solution. But
yeah,
if you have both, and if they have the same bill of materials, then it's reasonable to say that the testing that goes into your Premier solution accrues value into your integrated system as well. So any
hmm
OEM who has a Premier solution
hmm
and deliver lower tier solutions of the same hardware spec, it's reasonable to say that the testing applies there as well.
yeah. So going with an OEM who's been in this game for like 10 years, pioneered support contracts, has both offerings, brings with it a lot of value, right? So the other thing that happened in 2023 was Microsoft's announcement of the kind of adaptive cloud strategy, right? Which at first I was kind of like, oh, what is this? Do we need a new term, right? But I've actually grown to like it because, like you said at the very beginning of this discussion, we have lost cloud. It's gone.
Yep.
It doesn't mean anything anymore. It means everything, right? And so that is kind of problematic. We also have hybrid, multi-cloud, distributed, edge, IoT stuff going on, right? We have a whole plethora of phrases and words and acronyms and all sorts, right? And Microsoft are kind of so based on this last decade, right, journey, they're saying, hey, as Azure, as the Azure offering, we understand not all workloads can move to a Microsoft data center. So we want to adapt to those workloads. Those workloads and that data that can't move into a Microsoft data center and need to run at the edge in a data center wherever, we want to be able to adapt so that you can have consistency, right, across those different environments within the Azure portal, and you can have central visibility within the Azure portal. And we are going to also bring and extend Azure, governance, management, security services to those workloads as well. So Microsoft are now saying, hey, Azure is going to be this adaptive cloud, and we are going to adapt to different scenarios and workloads regardless of where they run. And that is all powered by Azure Arc, right? Which is also powering Azure Local. And so this is a big change for them back in 2023. That's when it kind of started happening. And then what we've seen at Ignite in November 2024, just a few months ago, right, was the kind of expansion of that. They were really driving that home, and Azure Local became a fundamental part of that. And so, kind of, what is your take on the Azure adaptive cloud strategy?
I think that anytime I have a conversation with anyone about any of the stuff, the first thing that I do is come to common language. So make sure that we're talking about the same things in the same way. It's more and more difficult around terminology like cloud in particular, but also hybrid and multi-cloud. So having a term that people don't have cemented in their mind as a thing that you can define and then work from, I think is really valuable. So adaptive cloud there, I think, makes a lot of sense. It reclaims terminology and helps us to communicate better. That can only be a positive thing, I think. On the and then the renaming to Azure Local. Probably should have stuck to the timeline because things would have been easier now. But
that's
my bad. That's my fault. But
you got excited. It's fine.
I think that as we went through the timeline, there were a few things that came up. There was Azure Stack HCI, of course, was one thing. There was Azure Stack Hub as well, separate thing. You mentioned Azure Stack Edge as well. Three separate products in the Azure Stack portfolio with different features, functionality, target use cases, product management teams, engineering teams, support, licensing, procurement methods. Just three silos of stuff, but with the same name. And it was horrible to communicate that to customers. Like, you go out there and start talking about Azure Stack, you spend the first half hour defining the portfolio and then the bit that you want to talk about. Not fun. No. And I guess that's part and parcel of it being a decade-old name. The Azure Stack name was first mentioned in 2015, and with 10 years of heritage comes 10 years of baggage there. So first thing is the rename to Azure Local gets rid of the baggage. That's a positive. Really good thing. But it's not just a rebranding. So it's not just rebranding Azure Stack HCI to Azure Local. It's also bringing the features and functionality and target use cases that were addressed by Azure Stack Edge and Azure Stack Hub as separate products within that one product umbrella there. So
Yes.
at Ignite, Microsoft, yes, renamed Azure Stack HCI to Azure Local Connected Solutions, but also announced that Azure Local would deliver disconnected solutions.
Yep.
That's not by bringing Azure Stack Hub in, that's by making Azure Local, Azure Stack HCI, Azure Local operate as a disconnected solution, and then also announcing the intent to deliver smaller form factor edge solutions there as well. Again, taking functionality historically delivered by Azure Stack Edge under that Azure Local umbrella, but as one product. So not 3 different products under one name, but rather one product, one name, 3 different bits of functionality. And that is super valuable, super important there. It simplifies things tremendously moving forward.
Yeah, 110%. And it's really important to understand that when we're saying 3 different products, you mentioned this, 3 different engineering teams, product management teams, licensing, etc. It was difficult. And even as Azure Stack HCI has started to evolve, we did have that kind of baggage and that heritage of what people had heard about Azure Stack originally when it was Azure Stack Hub, etc. There was a lot of time spent kind of explaining the history and where we were today and how Azure Stack HCI is not the same as Azure Stack Hub, etc. And I think it's really important to call that out as well. So at Ignite, Azure Local, renaming, rebranding, but really an evolution. It is also going to provide a disconnected offering, and they are going to provide an edge offering. But this is not by taking Hub and Azure Stack Edge. Yeah. It's making Azure Local, Azure Stack HCI, be able to deliver on these two fronts. And I think that's really important to understand. So exciting times. It's been a ride for the last 10 years, that's for sure. What are you most excited about in terms of the future for Azure Local over the next few years? I know there's probably some stuff that you can't share, right? But in terms of what is in the public domain right now, what are you most excited about over the next few years when it comes to Azure Local, Azure Adaptive Cloud?
So number one, something which happened at Ignite or was announced at Ignite and is taking effect this month is the move of AKS to being free or at least no additional cost. That I think is one of the tremendous enablers for bringing Azure services on premises. For those that don't know, AKS, the AKS management components are just included out of the box with Azure Local. So you deploy an Azure Local system. When you're finished, you can start deploying AKS clusters immediately and you get a managed experience there where you don't need to worry about the management components of that. Microsoft feeds and waters those while you just run Kubernetes clusters. That used to cost $24 per vCPU per month for those clusters. Now it costs nothing. So I think that that's amazing, frankly. So having Kubernetes there to just be part and parcel of your on-premises environment at no additional cost. I love it. That takes effect this month. Beyond that, later this year, I think that the zero-touch provisioning, the FIDO-based zero-touch provisioning of Azure Local is something which solves a lot of problems for Microsoft customers and for OEMs as well, particularly in the vein of keeping OS images and factory images up to date, because those are late bound at the point of deployment now. And it lets OEMs innovate faster, deliver more up-to-date solutions, and lets customers deploy at remote sites without having to have expertise on site there. You ship out this ZTP ready system out to an edge site, someone there just plugs it in and it shows up in the Azure portal and you deploy. It's wonderful. Cosmos did a demo of that in a demo video at Ignite, so recommend watching that. But that, I think, later this year is one of the things which is going to help everyone in the ecosystem here, Microsoft OEM and customer there the most.
And both of those things really both remove barriers, right? I know this sounds so cliche, but like removes barriers to innovation, but it does, because if you can have AKS out of the box, no additional cost on Azure Local, you can then run Azure AI containers and a whole bunch. It just opens up like the ability to, we've not even delved into Arc and what Arc is, but Arc is enabling the deployment of Azure like PaaS services to run on any infrastructure anywhere. It makes it real easy on Azure Local. So yeah, that was great. Do you know what? I feel good having done this. I feel like in my head, I was like, is this useful? Is it not? But I feel like it's important to do it. It seems like the right time as well. Azure Local, let's just describe where we've been, how we got here, some really useful nuggets of information to explain kind of why we've been on the journey we've been on with Azure to get to Azure Local. And now we can just focus on the future, right? Azure Local disconnected, Azure Local, I'm not going to use the edge word, but small form factor for the edge, right? We can just focus on the future. So thank you so much for joining me. It has been too long. We will, let's not leave it this long again. And yeah, it was great.
It was fun. Yeah, let's do it again in another 10 years.
Yes, I will hold you to that. Thanks everybody for watching.